Hey, welcome everyone. Thanks for being with us today. This is Simon Rosenberg here, Hopium Chronicles, back for another live event. Joining me today is an old friend, Garrett Graff, who is, since I've known him when he was a young guy, has become one of our most thoughtful commentators and authors and journalists and historians, writing about really big subjects, and even a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Garrett, I didn't know that until today when I was looking at your. By the way, congratulations on that. That's pretty amazing. You also have a place where you write all the time called Doomsday Scenario, which is a newsletter and a site that I have found to be really thoughtful and interesting. And I'm a reader myself of your work, and so thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. My pleasure. We have been friends, I think, for long enough that when we got to know each other, we thought the internet was going to be a good thing for American politics.
Yeah, listen, I have a lot of bastard stepchildren in my political career. And, as somebody who was an early connector of Silicon Valley to the Democratic Party 30 years ago, this isn't exactly how I thought it was all going to turn out. But anyway, yes. So listen, I have just found your commentary on, the struggle, the Trump's enthusiastic efforts to attempt to end our democracy to be helpful to me in understanding the moment. Your writing is wonderful, by the way, just as somebody who writes every day. And you had a piece a few days ago that I wanted to start with in our conversation today, which is called 3 Reasons That I Still Have Hope for America. And I wonder if you could reflect on that as a way to kick this off.
Sure. And thanks, Simon. I think that sort of I started this column and website a couple of years ago. It's called Doomsday Scenario because much of my history writing is about doomsday scenarios of nuclear war, pandemics, sort of the worst one can imagine. And so the name was originally chosen much more tongue-in-cheek and has unfortunately now mostly become a story of the democracy and backsliding in the United States. And I think, as you know, I'm spent 20 years as a magazine writer and journalist. And I think about 97% of the value of my columns, as I hear from readers, is simply telling people that they are not crazy and that they're not wrong and that this is a weird moment and it is outside the bounds of our normal history, and that all of the media gaslighting that we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis in America and the sort of cognitive dissonance of, Trump is taking a different tone in Washington and pushing the boundaries of normal presidential power that I think you see in the headlines and stories of a lot of the traditional media right now is in fact wrong. That in fact we are living through something that is very different and distinct from what we have been through before. And so as I have been tracking this and writing about this over the course of the year, I'm still actually very much a believer in the United States and the American system. I'm someone who, in sort of the Madeleine Albright frame, as she once described herself as an optimist who worries a lot, I think that, what we are living through is not irreversible. It's not permanent, that the story of America is a story of a imperfect country that across decades and generations and centuries tries to get better. And so the piece that I wrote last week heading into No Kings weekend was trying to list the sort of 3 main reasons I have hope for our country and the American experiment and the future. I'm the parent of young kids, and in some ways I feel like I have to hold on to a promise and optimism about the future of our country and our world. And the first is, I think, something that became very clear to people as we watched the new kings unfold, which is I have a lot of confidence and hope and in America's people, that there are more of us good people in America than there are the racists and the white nationalists and the corrupt criminals who are trying to turn our government into their personal piggy banks. And I think that's something that we've seen a lot of people sort of come out of last week, understanding and, sort of embracing. That I think we, and you were actually writing a little bit about this today as well. Yeah. I think we have to recognize that actually Donald Trump is a historically unpopular president, that 2/3 of Americans did not vote for him. He is remarkably unpopular right now. And I think, as I wrote, Donald Trump, Stephen Miller, and the other corrupt cronies and would-be fascists of this administration are in many ways racing the clock. That I think a lot of these moments that we sort of see the administration as doing this like naked power grab, that these naked power grabs are actually coming out of weakness, not of strength. And I think that I am optimistic that at some point the how and where and when to organize and capitalize on this unrest and dissatisfaction remains an open question. And I have a lot of questions about whether the sort of organized national leadership of the Democratic Party is correctly positioned or capable of leading and organizing that dissent. But I think there are more of us than there are of them, and that gives me a lot of hope. The second, as I already mentioned, is my sort of sense of history of this, that America's progress has always been imperfect. We were a country that was founded with this incredibly imperfect goal of all men are created equal, a phrase that at the time, excluded not just women and minorities and Native Americans, but actually even white men who didn't own property at that time. That, Thomas Jefferson's frame of all men are created equal was this incredibly narrow frame of white property owning men, but that generation by generation, we have expanded the vision of who is American, and that progress has not always been steady. It has not been linear. It sometimes takes a very long time for us to live up to the promise that we have tried to make. It took 100 years from Reconstruction to the dismantling of Jim Crow and the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And that, my sort of hope of our history is that even though this might be a very dark chapter right now, and it may be a chapter we have never been through in American history, as I was saying at the start of our conversation, but that I have hope that on the other side of it, we can sort of pick up the American story and continue to build it going forward. And then, the third, I sort of joke, but it is in fact a very real one for me, is I have a lot of actuarial hope in America, which is Trumpism, I do not believe will last much past the end of Donald Trump. And even as we sort of have a new freak out this week about, the possibility of him going for a third term, he is a old man who is probably less well than the media is willing to dig into. He is probably less well than we are being told that he is. And that his reign at its maximum is only ever going to be measured in years and not of decades. And that matters, that he is not going to be the Franco of the United States, who reigned from the 1930s to the 1970s in Spain as a dictator there. I think one of the things we underestimate when we talk about MAGA as a movement is it's not a movement. It is a personality cult, and that this group of white nationalists and anti-government extremists and conspiracists and low information voters whose brains have been fried by right-wing media and social media algorithms, and people who have been rightly hurt by and disaffected through the experiences of globalization. I mean, workers for whom this economy is not working and that they are not wrong. And that's sort of a different conversation that we can have. But I think sort of part of this for me is us as Democrats admitting that Trump voters aren't wrong, or at least the chunk of them that are voting against the economic system that we have right now are not wrong. And but that this is not some sort of fixed political coalition that will hold together for the next 50 years. I think it's something that is going to splinter the moment Trump exits the stage, however that happens, whatever day that is. It is not a coalition that J.D. Vance is going to be able to hold together. It's not a coalition that Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz or Marjorie Taylor Greene or sort of whoever, or Don Jr. sort of most of all, that this is something that, we've already seen this year, some major fractures and splinters in the MAGA movement around issues like Jeffrey Epstein. I think once Trump is gone, however that happens, whenever that happens, and I have no particular insight or conspiracy to lay out there, but I know actuarially it will happen. That this movement will fracture, and there will be an opportunity, I think, to turn back to the people and the history and sort of pick up those first two pillars of hope at that moment, and try to rebuild and build something that was better than that which existed before.
So much there. Let me just sort of pick up on 2 points. And first of all, thank you for that. It was great to hear it all. I read it, but it's great to hear you lay it all out there. On the last part, one of the things that I've been writing about recently that's been sort of a data thing that's been very interesting to me is that if you look at the popularity of his agenda and the things he's doing, the agenda is now regularly polling in the 20s and low 30s and mid 30s, where his approval is 5 to 10 points higher than, let's say, many of the issues. And it gets to the point that you just made, number 3, which is that what's keeping them competitive and in the game is this attraction to him. Mm-hmm. And that when you remove him and you just sort of objectively look at what he's doing, the agenda is even much more unpopular than he is. And the fact that he can, for example, on the government shutdown, only get to 35% believing that it's the Democrats' fault is a sign of his ebbing powers, in my view, his ebbing powers of persuasion, which gets to the issue of his decline, right? Which I think, but it also gets to the centrality of this last point you're making, which I think is unbelievably important, is that fundamentally what he's done to the country he's harmed the country. I think people understand this now. I think they've come to understand he's doing material harm to the country. And so the MAGA part without Trump is much more unpopular than Trump is. and the legacy, that whenever he exits the stage, the damage the tariffs are doing, what he's doing in the violation of due process and what he's doing to immigrant families and American families all across the country, the destruction of our healthcare system that's underway right now. I mean, these are things that are going to long outlast him, that the rest of them are going to have to inherit and explain and justify. I call it defending the indefensible. And I think that the point that you make there is actually starting to manifest in the data itself, right? Where, the MAGA thing is much more unpopular than he is. And that's why I do think they're acting with such great urgency, is that I think they're aware that his time is limited, that he is ailing, that, and that they need to smash and grab and get as much as they possibly can, while he's still holding this whole thing together.
Yeah. And I think, it's unpopular for a lot of obvious reasons. America has resisted for 250 years having a masked, unaccountable secret police. And we don't love it when we begin to see it actually come to fruition in the United States. Donald Trump is a unique and powerful communicator. And I don't think you can imagine anyone trying to sell these policies to America with the success that Donald Trump has had once Donald Trump isn't the person doing that communication. Do we think that J.D. Vance is going to be able to sell American farmers on why we need to bail out Argentinian farmers before we bail out American farmers? I don't think so. That this is something where, this is not like put your head down and just wait for Donald Trump to go away. That's not what I'm arguing at all. But I think that we are seeing people really reckon with, I voted to burn it down this year or last year. But now that I'm seeing what that fire looks like, I actually don't want it to burn down like this.
Yeah, it is. Listen, as somebody who's been studying polling, full time for 33 years since the 1992 campaign, his decline has been shocking, actually, politically. But the decline of his agenda, the rejection of his agenda, I think is even almost more shocking. And I think it's something that hasn't gotten as much attention in the sort of discourse, right, about what's happening with them. And that I do think people have figured it out. I think they are aware that whatever he thought he was going to do, what he's doing is not making their lives better. It's hurting the country. And they're unhappy about it. And thank God, by the way. I mean, I often say in my community that imagine if he was at 55% approval rating right now. Right. Imagine if this was all seen as, hey, this is really great. And so however your understanding is of how we get to the other side of all this, it starts with him being deeply unpopular and the country rejecting what he's doing. And that's happened. And that's really important. It's necessary. It's wildly insufficient for what needs to happen. But it was, in my view, a necessary thing to happen for us to get to the other side. I have two other things I want to bring up with you two other columns that you've written that I just want to get you to reflect on. You had one that I think just came out yesterday, right? About checks and balances and about, things holding. And I just thought it was so thoughtful and interesting. Can you walk us through a little bit about your argument about what the final break against autocracy really is in America?
Yeah. So this grew out of watching the destruction of the East Wing. I've written a lot about the White House as a building and as a history. And I think that the images out of the East Wing really resonate with Americans because they feel like such a physical manifestation of what Donald Trump is doing to our country. This is, the excavators and heavy equipment that are literally demolishing a 120-year-old piece of American history feels in many ways a microcosm of many of these Trump controversies. It came out of left field. The public was never told about it. There was no warning, no public debate, no one asked permission. It's all to serve Donald Trump's personal whim and vision for what he wants the country to be. No one asked for a giant 1,000-person gilded Kremlin-esque ballroom to be built at the White House. It's not that this was a key issue in the 2024 campaign. And it's all been done basically on the backs of a lie, which is the moment Donald Trump started talking about this, he said, don't worry, this isn't going to interfere with the existing building. And then, what turns out is happening is he's just tearing it down. And I think it resonates with people in part because it seems so nakedly corrupt and terrible. But it also, I think, for me, exposed something I've been talking and thinking about over the last couple of months, which is at the bottom of our constitutional foundation. It turns out there's only one check and balance that really matters, and that's good character. And that sort of the thing that holds the American system together is not the Constitution. It's not the checks and balances. It's not the laws that we write down. It's not the norms. It turns out that the thing that holds us together is that we elect people of good character who appoint people with good character who are backed up by a professional public service civil servant class who are of good character. And that doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that every government official has ever done. But, I've met a lot of government officials over the course of my career. You've met a lot of government officials, Simon, and Republican or Democrat or nonpartisan civil servants, almost to a person, I never had to doubt that they took their oath of office seriously, that they sort of weighed in the course of their decision making, am I living up to my oath? Am I protecting and defending the United States? Am I serving the Constitution and not a person? Am I giving my country my best advice? And it turns out that that's sort of the central thing that backs up all of our checks and balances. It turns out you can have all the checks and balances and all of the laws written down, but if, as we are experiencing right now, you have three branches of government where no one takes their oath seriously to enforce the Constitution, the checks and balances don't matter. If you have sort of Mike Johnson and John Thune not caring how the president is abusing the power of Congress as a co-equal branch, then Donald Trump can do anything that he wants. If you have, John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh sitting there writing opinions that sort of decide the politics first and then back into the legal reasoning for their chosen decisions, and are sort of not living up to their oaths to the Constitution, then it turns out Donald Trump can sort of do whatever he wants. And the thing that Donald Trump has figured out in our system is that laws and rules are for sissies. And that, the thing that sort of kept all of the previous residents of the White House from tearing down the White House without warning was that none of them would have dreamed of doing so. It's not that there was sort of, the 82nd Airborne was poised at the White House gates to stop the excavators from ever getting on the White House lawn before. It's that we elected people who took seriously their oaths of office and, they're sort of saw the Constitution as their ultimate guiding principle, and in the sort of presidential phrase, took care to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. And that it turns out just Donald Trump doesn't. and that when sort of there's no one left in our system with that sort of moral compass, he can get away with a lot more than we ever thought that he could.
I've often said that the book about the modern Republican Party that I'm never going to write, the title of it is Absence of Virtue, is and because it is shocking, as you laid it all out there, the abandonment of the constitutional order that we're undergoing right now is a team effort. It's not just him. And the shadow docket, we've had Leah Lippman on and others to talk about sort of the outrage of the shadow docket and the politicization of the court. And obviously Mike Johnson now turning off, like literally just sending Congress home, like he's dissolving, there's no need to legislate. I mean, this is why I'm focusing a lot on the budget and how we're actually going to get to a budget and whether we actually ever get to one, which I think is going to be this other kind of titanic fight between now and the end of the year. Not just about reopening the government, but do they have the ability to get a majority to pass a budget? Because I think they'll get rid of the filibuster, and I still think they're going to struggle to even pass a budget. And I think there are legitimate questions about whether Trump is just going to tell them, I don't need a budget. I'll just take the tax revenues coming in. We don't need a legislative branch. Supreme Court has eliminated the independent judiciary, at least at the level of the Supreme Court, because they are now working for him. He wants to get rid of the legislative branch too, right? Why? And the main job of the legislative branch is to create a budget. That's why I think this budget, this issue around what happens to the budget at the end of the year is going to be really like a titanic fight in the evolution of this question of how far do they go, right? In breaking down, abandoning our democracy. I want to go to one last thing because I could talk to you all day. I originally was going to reach out to you, and I just didn't do it, on your piece on the Kavanaugh stop, which I loved. And I also think it's something that is not adequately understood in terms of what's happening now to just people. Because, I often say, Garrett, that we have to do a better job when we talk about what's happening with DHS and ICE to not use words of otherness, of othering people, of immigrant, migrant, undocumented, Hispanic, minority, right? Which then creates, in many ways, creates a justification for the actions, because as opposed to just calling them people, right? These are just people. They're not, yes, they happen to have other attributes, but I think that we, even in our own language, we allow othering language to come in to create a sense that they're different from us. And therefore the treatment they're getting is somehow implicitly justified, right? And I think that the Kavanaugh stop is so critical to all of this. And I wondered if you could just, share your thoughts about this and explain what the Kavanaugh stop is for everybody.
So for people who are new to me, sort of the main thing that I actually cover and write about is national security and federal law enforcement. This is what I have. I've written several books on the FBI. I actually spent years at Politico writing about the corruption of the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection in the Obama administration. I mean, this is 20 years of sort of out of control corruption that we have seen at the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection long before we got to the sort of newly empowered, super empowered ICE and CBP of Trump 2. And so I've spent a lot of this year writing about ICE, writing about CBP, writing about sort of this disastrous hiring surge that ICE is undergoing right now. And I'm sort of this piece that you mentioned on the Kavanaugh stops was actually focused on that big DHS raid on that Chicago apartment complex a couple of weeks ago now, which was actually mostly a CBP operation, not an ICE operation, because CBP is sort of equally terroristic in a lot of their tactics at this point in a lot of these targeted communities. And it harkened back to me as a historian to the Palmer raids, which was this very dark period in the wake of World War I, where the U.S., in sort of what was really the first Red Scare, cracked down on suspected communists. And it was really one of the darkest chapters of U.S. history. That it was a series of sweeping raids overseen by Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, led in no small part by a young, ambitious, up-and-coming bureaucrat named J. Edgar Hoover, that swept up thousands, perhaps as many as 10,000 sort of suspected communists across the country, most with very little due process, very little accusation, and sort of a period came to be known as the Palmer Raids. And it was terrible for American civil liberties. And it feels like, to me, we are sort of starting to see DHS embark upon a similarly lawless moment. And it's a lawless moment that has been enabled, I think is the best word, by Brett Kavanaugh, who there was a Supreme Court case earlier this fall that held, this is Chrissy Nome via Vasquez Perdomo, that explicitly allowed ICE to racially profile brown people on the streets of America. That this grew out of Los Angeles, where ICE was basically just like going to construction sites, going to Home Depots, and like stopping brown people. And their total sort of cause for suspicion was, this is a brown person who works in construction, so they're probably illegal. And the court case sort of all the way up held, you can't do that. Like that's like as naked sort of racial profiling as you could possibly imagine. And that we sort of do not live in a country, we have not lived, we have chosen not to live in a country where armed officers of the state can just walk up to someone on the street and shout, you know, papers, papers, papers. And you don't have to carry proof of citizenship to go to the grocery store or the hardware store in America. And that at the Supreme Court, they held that it's totally fine for ICE to do that. And Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote, I think, a very important dissent where she said the Constitution does not permit the creation of such a second-class citizenship status. And yet that's exactly what John Roberts' court did. Now, Brett Kavanaugh's role comes into this as an important way, where he wrote a concurring opinion, where, so just to sort of point this out, Brett Kavanaugh didn't have to write these words down,
Right.
but went out of his way because he thought that this was an important point that he wanted to put on the record. And what he wrote was that he wrote a concurring opinion that laid out sort of how he imagined friendly consensual encounters with immigration officers go on America's streets. And he said, there's a quote, "The government sometimes makes brief investigative stops to check the immigration status of those who gather in locations where people are hired for day jobs, who work or appear in jobs such as construction, landscaping, agriculture, or car washes that often do not require paperwork. If the officers learn that the individual they stopped is a U.S. citizen or otherwise lawfully in the United States, they promptly let the individual go." Now, that is not how any of these encounters go on the streets. That might be how a ICE officer would come up to Brett Kavanaugh, a sort of elite, privileged white guy walking in his Tony, D.C. neighborhood. But that is not how any of these encounters are going down, as we are watching daily on TikTok, on Instagram, on video, on social media. You're seeing agents and officers, tackle people and wrestle them to the ground, detain U.S. citizens sometimes for days at a time. There was, I think it was a ProPublica piece last week that found 170 cases, something like 170 cases of U.S. citizens being detained by ICE before being able to sufficiently prove that they were American citizens, and being released, sometimes for days at a time, sometimes being kept away from lawyers. I mean, all sorts of sort of terrible stuff. And that language has led people online to begin to call these Kavanaugh stops, sort of the idea that, you know, ICE is able to come up to you as a brown person, you have Brett Kavanaugh to thank. And my piece was sort of expanding this idea to sort of look at this as the era of Kavanaugh raids, a la the Palmer raids, and that I think and I hope that this era that language will sort of go down in history and sort of forever be a dark spot on Brett Kavanaugh's historical legacy.
Well, and man, there's so much you just put on the table, and for time reasons, I'll be brief, is that, you know, what's important about what you just said, and the reason I really wanted you to talk about this, is that, you know, in the Palmer raids, it was the Attorney General. In this time, creating the identity around one of the Supreme Court justices is very important, because of the things that we have to do on the other side. In my view, one of the greatest challenges we're going to have is what to do with the Supreme Court, and how we restore the court to being something of integrity and virtue, as opposed to what it is now, which is, I call it the corrupt Roberts Court and not the Supreme Court in my own writing. And it's why I think that the words that have evolved around Kavanaugh and attaching him to this is actually so strategically important. I mean, this is a big deal. This happened, however it bubbled up through the internet, right? Because it's also, you know, and I'm sorry if I was like almost bursting out laughing when you were talking, because there is a level of just such incredible absurdity about what Kavanaugh wrote. I mean, the whole reason this has become it's just like, it's ridicule and mockery and absurdity in this sort of like, it's like the Fox News bubble. You know, Greg Sargent calls Foxlandia as the term he uses for this imaginary place they go where Trump is 20 years old and virile, and, you know, the economy's booming, and this imaginary world they go into. And I think that the green light that the Supreme Court has given to Trump and the Trump regime to terrorize people living here in America, starting with, you know, brown people, but we all know through history, right, this can start with a minority group and continue to march on to much wider circles. And certainly Trump has certainly been overtly threatening that, you know, in recent weeks, that it is an unbelievably dark series of events that have been enabled by the Supreme Court. And their enabling of this is a critical part of the story, because it is going to create, as part of the story we need to tell about the reform of the court whenever we get to that part of the reconstruction of the United States, whatever we're going to call it, the revitalization of the country, the restoration, or the reimagination perhaps is better, is this Kavanaugh stop and Kavanaugh raids is really important. And I thought your piece just nailed that, the significance of that. So thank you for that. Brother, I could talk to you all day. We try to keep these things to no more than a half an hour. We've already hit 40 minutes. I just want to thank you for in a time of such uncertainty, you know, the clarion voice, your excellent writing. I encourage everybody to follow Garrett and his work. We'll make sure it'll be in all the links to everything, when we release this. Any final thoughts for folks today before we go? I mean, any final words? I love your theory of hope, because here, you know, the other thing I'll just say is that where I also just want to really put an exclamation point on something you said that we talk about a lot at Hopium, is that Trump is escalating now, because I think he does feel his power is ebbing, and that he is ailing, and that he's in cognitive and physical decline, that he's in political decline. And there's become, and that sense of insecurity and that worry that the country's really turning on them, and that, you know, they're in opposition as opposed to being loved, is accelerating the more paranoid, the paranoid part of this, the domestic crackdown against his opponents. And to your point, the most important thing you said to me today is that he's doing this because he's weak and not because he's strong.
Yep.
And that is something we talk about all the time, that we need to defeat the strong man. We need to make him weak and not strong. We need to make him a villain and not a hero. We need to make him a loser and not a winner. We need to make him a failure and not a success. That this is part of our job in this process, that we can't, because part of his strongman power is through the perception of his strength. And part of our job is to spend every day pulling the curtain back from the wizard and taking away that strength and not buying and not obeying in advance, as Timothy Snyder told us. And I thought the way that you described that in your piece and you did today was incredibly important. And so thank you for everything you just shared with us. And hopefully, we can have you back. But why don't you bring it to a close? Any final thoughts today?
And thanks for all of that. And I sort of couldn't agree more with your mission here and hope at Hopium. But I think this is the point that, like, these are not strong people. And in fact, I think sort of part of why the Kavanaugh stops and Kavanaugh raids catch on is because it's so obviously wrong and clownish. And I think one of the things that, as we watch this rising tide of authoritarianism in America, is pointing out that these are clowns doing clownish things. Not in a ha-ha funny way, but in a sort of not very competent and kind of laughable way. This is why the sort of frog in Portland is so effective. Donald Trump is trying to sort of invent this idea that there's a war with Antifa on America's streets, a group that does not actually exist at all. And these images of people in inflatable animal costumes, facing down, men dressed like they are about to invade Fallujah, actually really resonate with Americans, because it sort of shows how clownish this actually is.
Listen, we talk a lot about at Hopium, just to wrap, that the emergence of ridicule and mockery in the last few weeks has become really, really important. This is a powerful set of new tools that we have that we didn't have 3 or 4 months ago, that are now, become vital to this effort. And I think that, one of the things that I often talk about in my own commentary is that, there is something so fundamentally ridiculous about what's happening, and that we can't lose sight of that. We have to keep connected to that. And Garrett, one of the things that I have been thinking about a lot, and this will be your homework assignment, and we can talk about it next time, is, whether or not people who've gone through this in other countries have had the same kind of feeling that we've had about when it happened here. I didn't think it would be so clownish and that it would be so ridiculous on the face of it. I thought it somehow there would be more gravity and seriousness tied to, the ending of American democracy. But even the tearing down of the East Wing and this unbelievably insane ballroom that he wants to build, by the way, with a glass. Did you hear him talking about this? So in the design, I'm sorry, it's just so absurd. So in the design of the ballroom, to get to the ballroom from the main building, there's the covered area where mortals will walk, where normal people will walk. He, however, has a glass passage that he will be able to walk on top of the lower part where the hoi polloi have to walk, right? The people, the unwashed have to walk, right? And the oligarchs. He's going to have a special passage above the other passage that's glass enclosed, so that when he walks across to the palace, to his new palace, that he will be visible to all and that it isn't covered and it's glass. And it's, in some ways, when I heard him talking about this yesterday, I was like, this can't really be true. This can't. And then I went and looked at the Washington Post rendition of it, and you can see the glass passage on top of the passage where normal people have to walk. And I don't know. It was one of those moments where this is the worst simulation we've all ever been through, right? And but listen, brother, you, in a time of great need for the country, you're stepping up, I'm grateful for that. You've contributed so much over so long. And then finally, as I close almost every talk that I give here, the reason that I do this work is for the future of my kids and my grandkids. And I share that same motivation that you have, that, that we have an obligation to try to leave to our kids and our grandkids the same opportunities that we had and the same democracy that we had. And so we have an obligation to do this work for them. And so I also wanted to say I share that deeply with what you said today.
Thanks, Simon. Pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, man. Thanks, everybody. Listen, if you enjoyed this, please follow Garrett's work. He is prolific. He's brilliant. He's insightful and brilliant, glorious writing as well, as somebody who's a writer. And if you please like this today, share it with others, and subscribe to Hopium so you get more amazing discussions like this. Thanks all.